It's March 29th, 1999. The UConn Huskies are getting ready to take the court for their school's first ever chance at a national title. The Huskies carry with them the failure and disappointment of years past, but all of that can be put to bed with one win. Going back in UConn's history, you will find there was no shortage of heartbreak. They went to their first Elite Eight in 1964, where they would end up getting blown out by the eventual national runner-up, the Duke Blue Devils. They wouldn't make it back to the Elite Eight until 1990, 27 years later, where they would yet again fall to the Blue Devils. This time, thanks to a heartbreaking buzzer beater from one of college basketball's greatest villains, Christian Laettner. Duke would also go on to knock UConn out of the tournament the following year in the Sweet 16. However, this time it was done in much more convincing fashion. 5 years later, led by superstar guard Ray Allen, they would reach the Elite Eight again, but they would fall in another heartbreaking close game to the UCLA Bruins. They would make it back in 98, but it wasn't meant to be, as they would fall again, this time to an absolutely loaded North Carolina Tar Heels team, which leads us to the 98-99 season, and a team that carried with it the scars of seasons past. The Huskies came into the season ranked number 2 in the country, led by their star guards Richard "Rip" Hamilton and Khalid El-Amin. UConn would go on to see 3 top 25 opponents in their first 8 games, running over the likes of Washington and Michigan State before fighting off a pesky 20th ranked Pitt team. The Huskies would go on to win their first 19 games of the season, looking every bit the contender they were believed to be at the start. But in game number 20 of their season, they would get blown out at home by number 16 Syracuse. However, UConn was without their star guard Rip Hamilton, who missed the game with an injury. The Huskies would bounce back with a 4-game winning streak that included a massive win over the top 5 ranked Stanford Cardinal. But another loss was right around the corner. This time, it was the 15th ranked Miami Hurricanes. However, the Huskies would go on to finish the regular season 3rd in the polls despite their late season losses, and they never fell lower than number 4. They entered the Big East tournament as the clear favorite, but in their first game of the Big East tournament, they were given all they could handle by a tough Seton Hall Pirates team. UConn would go on to win a close game 57-56. After that, it was clear sailing for the Huskies as they would walk through the rest of the Big East tournament and claim their second consecutive Big East title. UConn would enter the NCAA tournament as the number 1 seed in the West region, where the Huskies would start their run in dominant fashion, slicing through the first 3 rounds without breaking much of a sweat at all. But then came the vaunted Elite Eight, where UConn was 0-4 all time. But if ever there was a team to break that spell, this was it. In the Elite Eight, the Huskies would meet up with the 10th seed out of the West region, the Gonzaga Bulldogs, who, just like the Huskies, were looking for their first ever Final Four appearance in school history. Gonzaga would go on to put up a tough fight, never allowing the more talented Huskies to completely take over the game. But in the end, UConn was just too much as they would hold on for a 67-62 victory. Finally, after all of the heartbreak and all of the years of falling just short, UConn had finally reached the Final Four. In the national semifinal, UConn would meet the Ohio State Buckeyes. Led by star guard Michael Redd, the Buckeyes were having an outstanding run through the tournament, knocking off the likes of 1 seed Auburn and 3 seed St. John's. But yet again, the Huskies would be too much, led by their star guards Rip Hamilton and Khalid El-Amin, who went on to score 42 of the team's 64 points en route to a Huskies victory where they secured their first chance at a national title. However, despite their incredible season and run through the tournament, UConn would enter the national title game as a massive 9.5-point underdog. To this day, there has not been a bigger underdog in the national title game since. So who was this massive favorite that was considered a lock to win the national title? Well, it was none other than the Duke Blue Devils, a familiar foe behind some of UConn's most heartbreaking tournament moments. And this Blue Devils team was absolutely dominant, led by their stars Elton Brand and Trajan Langdon, who would both go on to become future NBA GMs, and behind them was an outstanding supporting cast that included the likes of William Avery, Shane Battier, and Corey Maggette. Duke had won 32 games in a row since an early season loss at the buzzer to the Cincinnati Bearcats. They were widely considered the best team in the country all year by a wide margin. Duke walked through their side of the bracket without much of a challenge at all. Michigan State was able to give Duke a little bit of a test in the national semifinal, but the Blue Devils proved to be too much for the Spartans on that night, setting themselves up to grab the national championship that most believed was theirs from the very beginning of the season. Which leads us back to March 29th, 1999, and a chance for UConn to shock the world and finally get their first national championship. But in the first couple minutes, it would be all Duke, as they would run out to a quick lead. But the Huskies would battle back thanks to some timely buckets from defensive wizard Ricky Moore and star guard Rip Hamilton. Both teams would trade buckets throughout the first half, with Trajan Langdon leading the way for Duke, while Elton Brand struggled thanks to some tenacious defense from the Huskies down low. Meanwhile, it would be Rip Hamilton and Ricky Moore who would continue to keep UConn in the fight throughout the first half, with star guard El Amin dealing with foul trouble early, keeping him from being a major contributor for UConn in the first half. Duke would go on to take a 39-37 lead into the half, thanks in large part to the three ball, where Duke was 5 for 10 in the first half. To start the second half, it would be time for UConn's role players to step up, as Kevin Freeman and Albert Mooring would continue to keep the Huskies on par with Duke, who continued to score despite UConn's physical defense doing a solid job keeping the Blue Devils stars in check. UConn would take a 5-point lead with just over 10 minutes left, the largest deficit that Duke had faced all tournament long. But the Blue Devils were the favorite for a reason, and despite facing legit adversity for the first time all tournament, they would fight back with their star Elton Brand stepping up in the clutch on both ends of the floor. Down the stretch, it seemed as though UConn was going to run out of gas. But in the final minutes of the game, UConn would turn to their star backcourt, and Rip Hamilton and Khalid El Amin would put UConn on their backs, hitting big shot after big shot in the final moments of the game. Duke would undoubtedly have their chances late, but UConn's defensive wizard Ricky Moore would step up, forcing two massive turnovers that would essentially end the game, with UConn finishing off their improbable victory over one of the most dominant teams in college basketball in the past 25 years. Finally, UConn had reached the top of the mountain after all the years of falling just short. They now had a championship to call their own. The Huskies have gone on to see a ton of success since this triumph in '99, as UConn has gone on to win more national titles than any other school in the 21st century thus far. Making that feat even more impressive is the fact that they've done it with 3 separate head coaches in Jim Calhoun, Kevin Ollie, and Dan Hurley. UConn also doesn't have the resources that some of the other top-tier basketball programs like Duke and Kentucky have, making this feat even more impressive. And that's just the men's program. The women's program at UConn continues to be the gold standard in college basketball under head coach Gino Auriemma. UConn deserves all the praise in the world for what they have done in the past 25 years. They went from the little engine that could to a modern-day bullet train, an inspiring story that should be respected by all fans of college athletics.